The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and fear through the Arizona territory as Dasan pressed his weathered body against the cold granite boulder. Below him, along the creek's muddy edge, a girl trembled like a wounded sparrow. And the sight of her terror sent memories crashing through his mind like an avalanche. Maria had been 15 too, with that same dark hair and those same frightened eyes the day the Copper Crown mine collapsed 7 years ago. 38 souls buried under tons of rock because the company saved money on timber supports. His daughter's laughter silenced forever by corporate greed. The pain never dulled it, just learned to hide better, waiting for moments like this to tear open old wounds. The girl below couldn't have been more than 15, her calico dress torn and waterlogged arms wrapped around her ribs as if holding herself together. Mud streaked her pale face, and her hair hung in wet tangles. The gravel bar where she crouched was littered with broken branches from recent storms, and the creek rushed past with the urgent voice of snowmelt from the Mogollon Rim. Dasan had been tracking elk when he spotted the riders, 2 men on horseback rifles ready searching the far bank, with the methodical patience of professional hunters. They hadn't seen the girl yet, but they would. The way they moved, casting back and forth like hounds, following a scent, told him everything about their lethal intentions. The scar along his jaw, a cavalry saber's kiss from his scouting days, throbbed in the cold air. Dasan was past 40 now, though exact numbers had lost meaning in a life measured by survival rather than years. What mattered was that his eyes remained sharp, his hands steady, and his instincts for danger as keen as the day he'd first worn the blue coat. He studied the girl's face as she lifted it toward approaching hoofbeats. Something about her stillness struck him as unnatural. She wasn't scanning for the noise's source, she was watching the water as if listening with her eyes instead of her ears. Without conscious thought, Dasan rose from his hiding place and moved down the slope, moccasins silent on wet stone. The girl's head snapped toward him, eyes wide with terror, but she made no sound. Not even a gasp. "Slow breath," he whispered, kneeling beside her. He pulled a tin pail from his pack and dipped it into the creek's icy flow. The water ran clear, despite recent rains fed by springs high in the mountains, where no mining claims had yet poisoned the earth. The girl watched his mouth as he spoke, her gaze fixed on his lips rather than his eyes. When he lifted the pail to rinse grit from her face, she flinched, but didn't pull away. Her trust came reluctantly, born of desperation rather than faith. "Easy now," Dasan murmured, letting water trickle over her forehead and cheeks. The mud washed away to reveal skin pale as birch bark, marked with small cuts from thorns or glass. Something about her features nagged at him, the high cheekbones, the stubborn set of her jaw. Familiar somehow, though he couldn't place why. "Those men hunting you?" She nodded once, sharp and certain. Across the creek, the riders had stopped. One, a thick man with a silver watch chain, stood in his stirrups and called out in a voice that carried over the water's rush. "Girl's gotta be here somewhere, Frank." Dogs picked up the scent strong of the mine. The second rider, a lean man with cold eyes, spat into the creek. "Could have drowned for all we know. That boiler blast knocked plenty of folks into the water. Shame if we lose her before we collect the bonus. Not this one." The first man replied, and something in his tone made Dasan's blood run cold. "She's too valuable to die easy. Too much like her stubborn mother. Mr. Harlan wants her alive, but if we can't manage that..." He shrugged. "Dead girls tell no tales." Frank laughed, a sound without warmth. "Dead girls are easier to carry, too. Less fuss all around." Dasan positioned himself between the girl and the riders, using the boulder and fallen pine for cover. His old cavalry carbine lay across his knees, loaded and ready, though he hoped not to use it. Violence had a way of spreading like wildfire in this country. The girl's fingers found his sleeve, and she pointed upstream where aspen marked a deer trail. Her message was clear, she knew a way out. But first, Dasan needed to understand What kind of trouble had found its way to his peaceful creek? He pulled jerky from his pack and handed it to her along with his water skin. She ate with careful desperation, never taking her eyes off the riders. When she finished, she pressed her palm flat against her chest, then pointed to herself. Lena. She mouthed the word silent but unmistakable. Dasan. He replied, speaking slowly so she could read his lips. She smiled, then the first real expression he'd seen, and something twisted in his chest like an old wound reopening. There had been another girl once with dark hair and trusting eyes. Maria, who would have been about this age, if not for the mine collapse that took her and 37 others when white men's dynamite brought down half a mountain. Maybe that's why he didn't hesitate when Lena reached for his hand. Maybe that's why he made the choice that would change everything. The riders were moving again, their horses picking careful paths along the rocky shore. In minutes, they would round the bend and spot their hiding place. Dasan gathered his pack and rifle, then helped Lena to her feet. "Can you climb?" he asked. She nodded and pointed again to the aspen grove. Together, they began their ascent up the steep bank, leaving the creek's cold comfort behind. Whatever had driven this girl into the wilderness, whatever made her valuable enough to hunt with dogs and rifles, Dasan knew he was about to become part of it. The shelter Dasan built was simple, but effective pine boughs against a fallen log with stones arranged for a smokeless fire. He kept the flames small, feeding them dry twigs seasoned by summer sun. Lena sat close to the warmth steam rising from her damp dress. "Tell me," Dasan said, facing her so she could read his lips in the firelight. He'd learned that communication required patience, and this girl clearly needed every word spoken where she could see it. Lena touched her ear, then shook her head. Not completely deaf, he realized, but damaged. She mouthed words back, "Mother." "Gone." "How gone?" Her hands moved in gestures that painted a picture of explosion fingers spreading outward like a blast, then pointing toward the valley where Sable Junction lay hidden in evening shadows. She tapped her ear again, harder this time, and Dasan understood. The blast that had taken her mother had also stolen much of her hearing. "The mine?" he asked. She nodded, then drew in the dirt beside the fire. Her finger traced the outline of a building with a tall smokestack, then a series of lines that might have been machinery. The Black Lark mine, Dasan realized. He'd seen its stamp mill from ridge trails, heard its thunder echoing through canyons at all hours. Lena's drawing grew more detailed. She sketched figures around the building workers, he assumed, and what looked like a woman in a long dress standing near the boiler house. She pointed to the woman, then to herself. "Your mother worked there." Another nod. Then Lena's expression darkened, and she scratched out the woman figure with violent strokes. Tears left clean tracks through the remaining grime on her cheeks. Dasan fed another stick to the fire and considered what he knew of Sable Junction. It was a hard town that had sprung up around silver strikes and copper veins, the kind of place where money flowed like water during boom times and dried to dust when ore played out. The Black Lark was one of the larger operations, employing half the men in the territory. "You have people family in town?" Lena shook her head, then held up one finger. Just her mother now gone. The wind shifted, bringing wood smoke sent from distant chimneys. Somewhere in the valley, Sable Junction's people were settling in for another night, unaware that a frightened girl sat by a hidden fire, mourning her only family. Dasan's shoulder ached where an old cavalry bullet had chipped bone. The wound was 15 years healed, but cold weather always brought back the pain. He worked the joint carefully, feeling familiar grinding that reminded him of mortality's wages. "Those men," he said. "They from the mine." Lena's face hardened with an expression too old for her years. She nodded, then drew a rectangle in dirt and made marks inside numbers he realized arranged in columns like a ledger or account book. "Money." She shook her head and pointed to the marks, then to the scratched-out figure of her mother. Whatever those numbers represented, they were connected to her mother's death. As if reading his thoughts, Lena reached into her dress hem and pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth. Her fingers worked the knots with practiced care, revealing several pages covered with neat handwriting. Even in firelight, Dasan could see they were ledger sheets, the kind used to track expenses and payments. Lena smoothed one page flat and pointed to a name written at the top, Victor Harlan. Below it, columns of figures marched down the paper dates, amounts, and what looked like payments to various officials and suppliers. One entry caught Dasan's eye, a regular monthly payment labeled simply S. Corbett and Child Support Maintenance. The amount was substantial, far more than a bookkeeper's wages would warrant. Your mother kept books for the mine. Lena nodded, then pointed to one entry that made Dasan's blood run cold. It was dated 3 days ago, the day of the explosion. The entry showed a payment for dynamite, far more than any mining operation would need for regular blasting. The girl's fingers traced other entries, payments to the town marshal, the territorial tax assessor, even the local preacher. Bribes, Dasan realized. The whole system was corrupted from top to bottom. But that mysterious monthly payment bothered him. Why would a mine superintendent personally support one employee's family? She found this, he said, more statement than question. Lena nodded, then mimed her mother, pressing the papers into her hands. Her eyes filled again with tears that reflected firelight like fallen stars. The pieces were falling into place. A woman discovers her employer's corruption, possibly plans to expose it, and dies in a convenient accident. Her daughter escapes with evidence, becoming a threat that needs eliminating. They killed her, Dasan said. Lena's response was a single word, mouthed with vicious clarity, yes. The fire crackled between them, consuming dry wood and releasing stored sunlight of summer days. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack. Another answered from the opposite ridge. The night was full of hunters, and they had just become prey. We need to get this to someone who matters, he told her. Not the marshal he's bought. Territorial judge, maybe? Circuit court? Lena wiped her eyes and gathered the papers back into their oilcloth wrapping. When she looked at him again, her expression held determination that reminded him painfully of Maria, who had inherited his stubborn streak along with her mother's gentle heart. You understand what this means? Dasan asked. They won't stop hunting you. These papers are worth killing for. She nodded once, firm and certain, then wrote in dirt beside the fire, Justice. But there was something else troubling Dasan about those ledger entries, particularly that monthly payment to S. Corbett and Child. The amount was too large, too regular, too personal for a simple employee benefit. It suggested a connection between Harlan and Lena's family that went deeper than mere employment. He watched Lena as she stared into the flames, noting again those high cheekbones and stubborn jawline that had seemed familiar when he first saw her. Now, with that mysterious payment in mind, he wondered if the resemblance might be more than coincidental. The dogs found their scent at dusk. Dasan heard them first distant baying that echoed off canyon walls like voices of hungry ghosts. He looked across the small fire where Lena sat finishing the last of his jerky, her face pale in flickering light. Time to go, he said, already kicking dirt over flames. She heard urgency in his voice, if not all the words, and was on her feet before embers died. The oilcloth bundle disappeared back into her dress, and she shouldered the small pack he'd given her with efficiency of someone who'd learned to run for her life. The baying grew closer, joined now by thunder of horses moving fast through timber. At least 5 men, Dasan estimated, probably more. They'd brought a full hunting party. He led Lena uphill toward the creek's headwaters, where terrain grew steeper and forest thicker. Behind them, torches began to flicker through trees like malevolent stars. This way, he whispered, guiding her along a game trail that wound between granite boulders. The path was treacherous in darkness, but it would slow their pursuers more than them. A gunshot cracked through the night, followed by shouting voices. They'd found the abandoned campsite. Frank got the fire here still warm, the voice carried clearly in thin mountain air. Dogs got the scent. Frank called back his voice, carrying the cruel satisfaction Dasan had heard earlier. moving uphill toward water. Time to earn that bonus, boys. Easy money, if you ask me, another voice added. One half-deaf girl and an old Indian. Don't underestimate them, Frank warned. That Apache knows these mountains, and the girl's been running for 3 days. Desperation makes people dangerous. Dasan cursed silently. The hounds would follow their trail relentlessly now, and horses could cover ground faster than 2 people on foot. They needed an advantage, something to even the odds. The creek emerged from a narrow gorge ahead, cascading over worn stones in a series of small waterfalls. Dasan had fished these pools as a boy, learning their secrets from his grandfather. If memory served, there was a place where water had undercut the bank, creating a hidden overhang. "Can you swim?" he asked Lena. She nodded, though her expression showed she understood the water would be bitter cold. "Stay close, step where I step." They entered the creek just above the first waterfall, the shock of icy water driving breath from their lungs. Dasan felt his way carefully along the rocky bottom, using fallen logs and boulders for handholds. The current was strong but manageable, fed by snowmelt from peaks still white with early autumn storms. Behind them, the dogs grew more excited. Their baying took on the triumphant note that meant they'd found fresh sign. "There," a man's voice shouted, "tracks at the water." A rifle shot split darkness bullet whining off granite somewhere to their left. Then another closer this time, sending up spray of water and rock chips. Dasan pulled Lena deeper into the creek, where an overhung boulder created a pocket of calm water. They pressed themselves against stone, breathing hard, as torchlight began to dance on the opposite bank. "Lost the scent at the creek," someone called. "They're in the water. Have to be. Frank, take 2 men downstream. I'll take the rest up." Frank's voice carried over the water with professional calm. "Remember, Harlan wants the girl alive if possible. But if she won't come quiet, better a dead witness than a live one telling tales to territorial judges." Dasan counted shadows moving across torchlight, at least 6 men, maybe more. Too many to fight, even from good cover. They would have to be cleverer. He remembered the old pine tree that had been undercut by spring floods, hanging over the creek about 50 yards upstream. If he could reach the rope from his pack. "Wait here," he whispered to Lena. "Don't move until I signal." She grabbed his sleeve, eyes wide with fear. But he gently freed himself and disappeared into darkness. The current was stronger in the creek's middle, threatening to sweep him downstream toward searching men. But Dasan had learned to move like water itself during his scouting days, silent, persistent, flowing around obstacles. The old pine was exactly where he remembered its root ball, exposed by erosion trunk, angled across the creek like a bridge. Dasan pulled his rope from his pack and wrapped it around a stone, then worked his way to the opposite bank, where the tree's crown rested against the cliff face. The voices were getting closer now, harsh with frustration. "Tracks here," Frank called from downstream. "Fresh ones." That would be misdirection, an old deer trail that looked like human sign in torchlight. It might buy them a few minutes. Dasan tied his rope around the thickest part of the pine's trunk and gave it an experimental tug. The tree shifted slightly, tons of timber balanced on the fulcrum of the bank. Another good push would send it crashing into the creek, blocking passage and buying precious time. He worked his way back to Lena through frigid water that seemed to leach warmth from his very bones. She was exactly where he'd left her, crouched in the overhang's shadow, clutching the oilcloth bundle against her chest. "Now," he whispered. They moved together through the deepest part of the pool water, up to their chests, numbing cold, seeping through their clothes. Dasan felt for the creek bottom with each step, testing for holes or loose stones that might betray them with a splash. A dog began barking frantically somewhere upstream, followed by cursing as men crashed through underbrush. Torchlight was getting brighter, casting wild shadows on water. They reached the rope, just as the first hound appeared on the bank above them, hackles raised, baying its discovery to the night sky. Dasan gave the rope a sharp yank, and the old pine groaned like a dying giant. "What was that?" someone shouted. Another yank, harder this time. The tree's roots tore free from the bank with a sound like breaking bones, and the massive trunk toppled into the creek with a splash that sent water 20 feet into the air. The impact created instant chaos. Men shouted warnings, horses reared and whinnied, and at least one torch went out in a hiss of steam. The fallen pine now stretched across the creek like a dam, its branches creating a tangle that would take hours to clear. "Son of a bitch." Frank's voice rose above confusion. "They dropped the whole tree. Must have had it rigged," another man replied. "These Apache know every trick in the book." "Doesn't matter," Frank snarled. "We go around. Joe, take the horses back to the crossing at Devil's Bend. Rest of us follow the ridge trail. They can't have gotten far." Dasan helped Lena climb over the trunk's smooth bark, then dropped back into water on the far side. The creek ran clearer here, fed by springs that bubbled up from limestone caves. They could follow it for miles without leaving tracks. "Smart," Lena mouthed when they paused to catch their breath. Her lips were blue with cold, but her eyes held something that might have been admiration. "Not smart enough." Dasan replied, his own breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "They'll find a way around. Always do." The prairie stretched before them like a tawny ocean broken only by islands of sage and occasional twisted juniper. Dawn had revealed their true situation. No cover for miles, and their pursuers already visible as dust clouds on the horizon. Dasan had pushed them hard through the night, following game trails and creek beds, but now they faced open ground with nowhere to hide. Lena stumbled beside him, exhaustion written in every line of her small frame. She hadn't complained, hadn't even slowed her pace, but Dasan could see she was running on determination alone. The oilcloth bundle remained pressed against her ribs, protected by crossed arms. "Rest," he said, guiding her to shade of a lone cottonwood. The tree had been struck by lightning sometime in the past, its trunk split and blackened, but it offered the only shelter for miles. As Lena collapsed gratefully against scorched bark, Dasan studied their back trail. The dust clouds had grown larger, and he could make out individual riders now. 7 men, maybe 8, pushing their horses hard across the flatland. A high yipping call echoed across the prairie, answered by another from a different direction. Coyotes, but not the kind that hunted rabbits. These were the 2-legged variety circling their prey with practiced patience. "Trouble," Dasan murmured, checking his rifle's load. He had 15 rounds left, enough for a short fight, but not a siege. Lena looked up from where she'd been rubbing her feet, understanding his tension, if not his words. She pointed toward a line of darker vegetation that marked another creek, perhaps 2 miles distant. "Water," she mouthed. Dasan nodded. They needed water, but getting there would mean crossing open ground under the eyes of their hunters. He was weighing options when the first rifle shot cracked across the prairie, bullet striking the cottonwood's trunk with a solid thump. "Down!" he shouted, pushing Lena behind the tree's bulk. More shots followed, a coordinated volley that told him their pursuers had experience with ambush tactics. Bark exploded around them as heavy slugs tore into the lightning-split trunk, filling air with flying splinters. Lena pressed herself against ground, eyes wide with terror, the oilcloth bundle clutched to her chest. A fragment of bark had opened a cut on her cheek, adding fresh blood to grime and exhaustion that marked her young face. Dasan peered around the tree's base and saw the riders had spread into a wide line, advancing at a steady trot. Professional, he noted grimly. These weren't simple mine guards or hired drifters. Someone had invested in quality killers. He aimed carefully and squeezed the trigger, his shot taking the lead rider's horse in the chest. The animal went down in a rolling tumble, pinning its rider and scattering the others. Not a killing shot, but it would slow them. The return fire was immediate and accurate, forcing him back behind cover. Bullets whined overhead, and one struck so close to Lena that she cried out the first sound he'd heard her make. "We can't stay here," Dasan told her, raising his voice over the gunfire. "They'll circle us, pick us off." She nodded understanding and pointed again toward the distant creek. Her meaning was clear: run or die. Thunder rumbled overhead, and Dasan looked up to see dark clouds building from the west. A storm moving fast across the prairie with the promise of rain and confusion. If they could reach the creek before the riders closed their circle— "When I say go, run straight for the water," he told Lena. "Don't look back, don't stop. Understand?" She nodded, gathering herself like a runner at the starting line. Dasan waited for the next volley, then rose and fired 3 shots as fast as he could work the lever. One rider threw up his arms and toppled from his saddle while the others dove for whatever cover they could find on the open prairie. "Go!" They ran through knee-high grass that made each step a struggle, but it also provided some concealment from the marksmen behind them. Dasan could hear horses crashing through the vegetation, getting closer with each stride of their longer legs. Lightning split the darkening sky, followed by thunder that rolled across the prairie like artillery fire. The storm was moving faster than he'd hoped, bringing with it the kind of downpour that could turn dry creek beds into raging torrents. A rifle cracked behind them, and Dasan felt the bullet tug at his shirt sleeve. Too close. He spun and fired back, not aiming, just trying to discourage pursuit. The riders had spread out again, trying to flank them on both sides. Lena was flagging her breath, coming in sharp gasps that he could hear over the rising wind. She'd been running on empty for too long, and her small frame simply couldn't match the pace their lives demanded. "Here," Dasan gasped, catching her arm. "Lean on me." She shook her head stubbornly, but accepted his support, and together they continued their desperate flight toward the creek. The vegetation was getting thicker now, willows and cottonwoods marking the presence of water. Another gunshot closer this time, and Lena stumbled with a cry of pain. Blood darkened her dress just below the shoulder, not a direct hit, but a graze that burned like fire. Rage flared in Dasan's chest, hot and pure. These men weren't just trying to silence a witness, they were hunting a child like an animal. He turned and fired again this time, taking careful aim despite their desperate situation. The rider on their left flank jerked and fell, clutching his leg. The creek appeared ahead of them, wider than he'd expected, and running fast with recent rains. On the far side, a grove of mature cottonwoods offered real cover, but the water looked deep and treacherous. "Can you swim?" he asked Lena again. She nodded, though her face was pale with pain and exhaustion. The first raindrops began to fall as they reached the bank, fat drops that struck the dust like bullets. Within minutes, Dasan knew the storm would unleash its full fury and turn the prairie into a muddy quagmire. Behind them, their pursuers had closed to within rifle range. Muzzle flashes sparked in the gathering gloom, and bullets whined overhead like angry wasps. "Together," Dasan said, taking Lena's uninjured hand. "Don't let go." They plunged into the creek just as the storm broke overhead. The water was shockingly cold and deeper than it appeared, reaching Dasan's chest and coming up to Lena's neck. The current was stronger than expected, too, trying to sweep them downstream toward a tangle of fallen trees. A bullet struck the water near Lena's head, sending up a spray that mixed with the driving rain. Dasan pulled her closer to his side, using his body as a shield while they fought their way across the flood-swollen creek. His boots found purchase on the far bank, just as Lena's strength gave out completely. She sagged against him, nearly unconscious, and the oilcloth bundle still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. Dasan hauled her up the muddy slope and into the shelter of the cottonwoods, where the canopy provided some protection from the driving rain. Behind them, across the rapidly rising creek, their pursuers had taken shelter under whatever cover they could find. The storm had bought them time, but at a cost. Lena was injured and exhausted, their ammunition was running low, and the creek that had saved them might also trap them if it continued to rise. The Basque sheepherder found them at dawn, sheltering under a wind-twisted pine, with their clothes still damp from the creek crossing. Matias Arrieta was a weathered man in his 40s, with kind eyes and hands scarred by decades of hard work. His sheep grazed peacefully nearby bells, chiming softly in morning air. "Trouble follows you, my friend." he said to Dasan in accented English, glancing meaningfully at Lena's bandaged shoulder. A wry smile played at the corners of his mouth. The men who hunt you, they offer gold for word of a runaway girl. But then I am terrible at remembering faces. No, Dasan tensed hand, moving instinctively toward his rifle, but Matthias raised his palms peacefully. I take no gold from men who hunt children. The herder continued, his tone growing serious. But you should know they spread word in town that she stole payroll money. Makes people willing to help them. She stole nothing, Dasan replied. She carries proof of murder. Matthias studied Lena, who sat quietly beside the cold ashes of their fire, the oilcloth bundle never leaving her grasp. Something in her posture, the way she held herself with wounded dignity, seemed to convince him. There is a place, he said finally. My cousin's woman, she teaches the children in Sable Junction. Eleonora Pike. If anyone can help with your proof, it would be her. He scratched his grizzled chin thoughtfully. Of course, getting to town alive, that is the difficult part, eh? Dasan considered this. Getting back to town meant walking into the spider's web, but the territorial judge wouldn't be at Fort Whipple for another week. They needed allies, and a schoolteacher might have connections they required. The men hunting us, how many? I saw 7 yesterday questioning travelers on the stage road. They have the marshal's blessing, so most folks cooperate. Matthias reached into his pack and pulled out a bundle wrapped in canvas. Food and blankets. My burro can carry the girl if she cannot walk. Why help us? Dasan asked. The herder's expression darkened. I have seen what happens when powerful men make children disappear. In my country, in this country, it is the same evil. He shrugged, but his eyes remained hard. Some things are worth more than gold. Besides, he added with another slight smile, my sheep, they do not like men who smell of fear and guilt. As they prepared to leave, Matthias led them to a small cave hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss. My winter shelter, he explained. Safe for tonight. Tomorrow we find better way to town. Inside the cave, warmed by a small fire and fed on Matthias's hearty stew, Lena began to relax for the first time since their flight began. The sheep herder's presence seemed to comfort her, perhaps, because he reminded her that not all adults were threats. Tell me about your daughter, Lena said suddenly to Dasan, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear in the cave's silence. Maria. What was she like? Dasan went very still, the question catching him off guard. He rarely spoke of Maria to anyone, the pain still too fresh, even after 7 years. Why do you want to know? He asked. Because when you look at me sometimes, your eyes get sad. Like you're seeing someone else. The honesty in her voice, the way she met his gaze without flinching, reminded him so much of Maria that it took his breath away. His daughter had possessed that same fearless curiosity, that need to understand the world around her. She was brave, he said finally, staring into the fire. Braver than she should have been sometimes, always asking questions, always standing up for what was right. How did she? Lena started, then stopped herself. Die, Dasan finished. Mine collapse. Copper Crown mine about 100 miles north of here. She was visiting her friend whose father worked there when the supports gave way. His voice grew bitter. Company had been cutting costs on safety measures. Cheaper to buy a few officials than to install proper timber supports. Like the Black Lark, Lena whispered. Exactly like the Black Lark. Dasan looked at her, then really looked at her. That's why I couldn't leave you by that creek. You reminded me of her, but more than that, you're fighting the same fight she would have fought if she'd lived to grow up. Tears slipped down Lena's cheeks, but she wiped them away quickly. I'm sorry. About Maria. So am I, Dasan said. But maybe helping you means her death wasn't completely meaningless. They sat in silence for a while. listening to the fire crackle and the distant bleating of Matthias's sheep. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool. "What will happen to us?" Lena asked eventually. "Even if we reach the judge, will anyone believe us?" "The truth has power," Dasan replied. "Your mother knew that. It's why she died protecting those papers. I wish I could have saved her." "You did save her," Dasan said firmly. "You saved her sacrifice from being meaningless. You're carrying her truth to the light where it can do some good." Lena nodded, clutching the oilcloth bundle tighter. "I won't let them win." "I know you won't," Dasan said. "Maria would have liked you." They made their way toward Sable Junction by hidden paths, following creek beds and staying clear of main roads. Matthias proved invaluable, knowing every sheep trail and water source in the territory. His burro, a patient beast named Esperanza, carried Lena when pain in her shoulder became too much. As they traveled, Lena gradually opened up about what had happened at the mine. Speaking in careful lip-read words and occasional scribbled notes, she painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond simple embezzlement. Her mother, Sylvie Corbett, had been the mine's bookkeeper for 3 years. She'd discovered discrepancies in the safety budget money allocated for timber supports and ventilation systems that had been redirected to bribes and kickbacks. When she'd threatened to report violations to territorial authorities, the mine superintendent had arranged her death in what appeared to be an accidental boiler explosion. "She gave me the papers right before." Lena managed her voice a harsh whisper that spoke of damage done by the blast. "Said, if anything happened, take them to the law. But not local law. Someone who couldn't be bought." But there was something else troubling Dasan about those ledger entries, particularly that monthly payment to S. Corbett and Child. The amount was too large, too regular, too personal for a simple employee benefit. It suggested a connection between Harlan and Lena's family that went deeper than mere employment. He watched Lena as she rode Esperanza, noting again those high cheekbones and stubborn jawline that had seemed familiar when he first saw her. Now, with that mysterious payment in mind, he wondered if the resemblance might be more than coincidental. They reached the outskirts of Sable Junction as afternoon shadows grew long. The town sprawled along a shallow valley dominated by the Black Lark Mine's headframe and the constant thunder of its stamp mill. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and streets bustled with organized chaos of a mining boomtown. Matthias led them to a small house on the town's edge, where a woman in her 30s was hanging laundry behind a picket fence. Eleonora Pike had the kind of practical beauty that came from intelligence and strength of character. Her dark hair was pinned up severely, but her eyes held warmth when she saw Lena's condition. "Inside quickly," she said, scanning the street for watchers. "Matthias told me some of what's happening. You're not safe here." The schoolhouse was a single room with wooden benches and a pot-bellied stove, but Eleonora had converted the back into comfortable living quarters. She cleaned Lena's wound properly and applied fresh bandages, while Dasan kept watch at the windows. "Show me what you have," Eleonora said when Lena was settled with hot soup and clean clothes. The ledger pages spread across her kitchen table told a story of corruption that reached into every level of local government. Victor Harlan, the mine superintendent, had systematically diverted safety funds to bribe officials and silence potential whistleblowers. The most damning entry was dated the day of the explosion, a payment for enough dynamite to level a city block disguised as routine blasting supplies. "This is comprehensive," Eleonora murmured, making copies of key pages in her neat teacher's handwriting. "Names, dates, amounts enough to bring down half the territorial government." She paused, studying one particular entry with a frown. "But this payment here, S. Corbett and child support maintenance. That's not a typical business expense. Can you get it to someone who matters?" Dasan asked. "Deputy Boone might help. He's young but honest, and he's been asking questions about the explosion. She paused, her expression troubled. Problem is getting past the marshal. Harlan owns him completely. And there's something else. Boone's been torn up about this whole situation. He knows something's wrong, but he's caught between his duty to the badge and his loyalty to the truth. As if summoned by her words, heavy footsteps sounded on the front porch. Eleonora quickly gathered papers while Dasan positioned himself by the door, rifle ready. "Miss Pike." A young man's voice, uncertain but respectful. "It's Deputy Boone. I need to speak with you." Eleonora opened the door to reveal a man in his mid-20s, wearing a deputy's badge and an expression of barely controlled anxiety. Caleb Boone had the look of someone who'd signed up to keep peace and found himself in the middle of a war. "I know they're here," he said without preamble, then swallowed hard before continuing. "Harlan's men are turning the town upside down. But I've been looking at that mine explosion and—" He paused, running a hand through his hair. "Well, something doesn't add up, and I'm not sure what to do about it. The marshal keeps telling me to leave it alone, but I can't. Not when people died." "What kind of something?" Eleonora asked carefully. "Boiler was inspected just last week. Engineer said it was sound. Then suddenly it blows up with enough force to level half the building." Boone shook his head, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. "And the safety valve was found wired shut afterward. That's not an accident, that's murder. But when I tried to investigate further, the marshal shut me down. Said it was outside my jurisdiction." Boone's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, betraying the internal struggle between his conscience and his position. "I became a lawman to protect people, not to cover up their killers. But if I go against the marshal, I'll lose my badge. And without the badge, I can't help anyone." Eleonora made a decision that would save their lives. She showed Boone the ledger pages, watching his face grow pale as he read evidence of systematic corruption. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. "This is proof of everything I suspected and more." He looked up at Dasan with new respect. "You're the Apache scout, aren't you? The one who warned about unsafe mining practices years ago." "I am," Dasan replied simply. "Then you know what these companies are capable of." Boone's voice hardened with resolve. "This ends now. Judge Morrison's due at Fort Whipple day after tomorrow. If we can get there—" "Harlan won't let us leave town alive," Eleonora pointed out. "Then we don't leave openly." Boone was thinking fast now, his honest nature warring with practical demands of survival. "Night stage runs to Prescott at midnight. I can arrange passage, but you'll have to get to the station without being seen. The marshal's got men watching all the main roads." It was a desperate plan, but their only chance. As darkness fell over Sable Junction, they prepared for the most dangerous part of their journey, crossing a hostile town where every citizen might be an enemy, and every shadow could hide a killer. The ledger pages were divided between them, copies hidden in different locations in case they were separated. Lena sewed the originals back into her dress hem, while Eleonora kept handwritten copies in her school satchel. "Whatever happens," Dasan told them as they prepared to leave, "the truth has to reach that judge. Too many people have died for lies." But as they slipped through back streets of Sable Junction, avoiding main thoroughfares where Harlan's men might be watching, Dasan couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a carefully laid trap. The final game was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The stage station squatted at town's edge like a weathered fort, its adobe walls thick enough to stop rifle bullets, and its yard lit by torches that cast dancing shadows across hard-packed earth. Deputy Boone had done his work well. 3 tickets to Prescott lay waiting at the counter, and the driver had been paid extra to ask no questions. Dasan scanned surrounding darkness as they approached his instincts screaming danger. Too quiet, he thought. In a mining town like Sable Junction, there should have been more activity around the stage depot, late-night travelers, freight handlers, at least a few drunks staggering home from saloons. Lena pressed close to his side, the oilcloth bundle secure in her dress. Eleonora carried her school satchel and had donned her traveling cloak, trying to project the image of a teacher heading to a conference in the territorial capital. Something's wrong, Dasan murmured to Boone as they reached the station's covered porch. The deputy's hand moved instinctively to his gun. What kind of wrong? Before Dasan could answer, a figure stepped from shadows beside the station office. Victor Harlan emerged into torchlight like a spider leaving its web, dressed in an expensive suit that marked him as a man of means and influence. His face bore the confident smile of someone who held all the cards. Now that Dasan could see him clearly, the family resemblance was unmistakable. Harlan had the same high cheekbones as Lena, the same stubborn jawline, even the same way of tilting his head when concentrating. The monthly payments in the ledger suddenly made perfect, terrible sense. "Miss Corbett," he said, his voice carrying across the yard with false warmth. "I'm so relieved to see you safe." Two more men appeared from darkness, rifles held casually but ready. Then the marshal stepped into view, his badge glinting in firelight, and Dasan knew they'd walked into a trap. "Now hold on." Boone started, but Harlan raised a hand for silence. "Deputy, I appreciate your concern for this young lady, but there's been a misunderstanding." Harlan reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "These are guardianship papers properly notarized and sealed. Miss Corbett is my ward, and she's been missing for 3 days." The blood in Dasan's veins turned to ice water. He looked at Lena, saw her face go white with shock and something that might have been recognition. "That's impossible," Eleonora said, but her voice lacked conviction. Harlan smiled and unfolded the papers, holding them where torchlight could illuminate the legal text. "Lena Corbett, daughter of Sylvie Corbett, placed in my legal custody following her mother's tragic death. I've been supporting the family for years. There are bank records, payment receipts, sworn affidavits." As he spoke, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place for Dasan. Those monthly payments in the ledger, the familiar features he'd noticed in Lena's face, the way Harlan's men had called her valuable rather than simply dangerous. Boone took the papers with shaking hands, his honest face struggling to process what he was reading. The documents looked authentic, complete with official seals and witness signatures. "This can't be right," he said weakly. "I'm afraid it is." Harlan's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "You see, Lena is my daughter, born out of wedlock 15 years ago to a woman I cared for deeply but couldn't marry due to..." He paused delicately. "Social expectations. I've provided for them both ever since, quietly and discreetly." The words hit Dasan like physical blows. He looked at Lena, saw the truth in her horrified expression. She wasn't just a witness to Harlan's crimes, she was his blood, his responsibility, his guilt made flesh. "No." Lena whispered the word barely audible. "No, no, no. I know this is difficult, sweetheart." Harlan said, his voice taking on a paternal tone that made Dasan's stomach turn. "Your mother filled your head with wild stories about the mine, about me. Grief does terrible things to people. She became paranoid, suspicious, seeing conspiracies where none existed. But you're safe now. You can come home." Eleonora stepped forward, her teacher's instincts overriding her fear. "Even if this is true, it doesn't change what's in those ledgers. Murder is still murder." Harlan's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold as winter stones. "What ledgers would those be, Miss Pike? The ones my disturbed daughter claims to have found? The ones that supposedly prove wild conspiracy theories?" He gestured dismissively. Sylvie had been acting erratically for months before her death. She was convinced everyone was plotting against her, imagining danger where none existed. I tried to help her, offered to pay for medical treatment, but she refused. He turned his attention back to Lena, his voice softening with what might have been genuine emotion. Your mother was a good woman, but she was sick. The stress of raising you alone, the financial pressure, it broke something in her mind. She started seeing enemies everywhere, creating elaborate fantasies about corruption and murder. I should have intervened sooner. She wasn't sick. Lena said, her voice gaining strength. She was trying to protect people. From what, sweetheart? From accidents, from the natural dangers of mining work. Harlan shook his head sadly. Men die in mines. It's the nature of the business. Your mother couldn't accept that reality. Dasan's hand moved toward his rifle, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. The men with Harlan were professionals, and they'd positioned themselves to cover all angles of escape. This is legal custody. Harlan continued, his voice taking on the tone of wounded righteousness. I'm taking my daughter home where she belongs, away from the criminals and malcontents who've been filling her head with lies. She's not going anywhere, Dasan said, finding his voice at last. Harlan's attention focused on him like a rifle sight. Ah yes, the Apache scout. You've caused me considerable trouble, Mr. Dasan. Kidnapping a white girl, resisting lawful authority, destroying mine property. The territorial government frowns on such activities. I kidnapped no one. I helped a frightened child. Whose word will they take? Harlan asked mildly. A respected businessman and mine superintendent, or a savage who's been off the reservation without proper papers? The trap was perfect, Dasan realized. Even if they produced the ledger pages, Harlan could claim they were forgeries created by a disturbed girl and her Indian accomplice. The law would side with the white man in the expensive suit, just as it always had. But Lena stepped forward, and then her young face set with determination that reminded Dasan painfully of his own daughter. She looked directly at Harlan, reading his lips as he spoke. And when she replied, her voice carried clearly across the yard. You killed my mother. The simple statement hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Harlan's smile faltered for just an instant, and in that moment, everyone present saw the truth reflected in his eyes. Now, Lena, he said, his voice still gentle but with steel underneath. Your mother died in a tragic accident. You were there, you saw what happened. The boiler exploded. These things happen in dangerous work. The valve was wired shut. Lena said, her whispered words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I saw the wire. I saw you talking to the men who placed the dynamite. Harlan's mask slipped another degree. You're confused, sweetheart. The explosion damaged your hearing, perhaps your memory as well. You need medical attention, proper care. What I need is justice for my mother. The words fell into silence like stones, into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. Dasan saw Boone's face change as the deputy finally understood what he was witnessing. Not a custody dispute, but a confrontation between a killer and his victim's daughter. The papers might be legal, Boone said slowly, his hand dropping to his gun butt. But murder's still murder, blood relation or not. Harlan's patience finally cracked. Marshal, arrest these people for interfering with lawful custody. Use whatever force is necessary. The marshal drew his weapon, and the two riflemen raised their guns. In the space of a heartbeat, the situation went from tense negotiation to deadly standoff. But before anyone could fire, Lena pulled the oilcloth bundle from her dress and held it up for all to see. This is proof, she said, her damaged voice carrying farther than it should have. Names, dates, payments, everything he did, everyone he bought. My mother died protecting this. Harlan's eyes fixed on the bundle with the intensity of a rattlesnake watching prey. Those papers belong to the Black Lark mine. They're stolen property. They're evidence of murder, Dasan corrected. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring with armed men facing each other across the torchlit yard. In the distance, the stage they'd hoped to board rattled into the station, its driver oblivious to drama unfolding in the shadows. Everything balanced on a knife's edge now, truth against lies, justice against corruption, a frightened girl against the man who'd fathered and then orphaned her. Harlan stepped closer to Lena, his voice dropping to a whisper meant for her alone, but audible to everyone in the deadly quiet. "Come home, daughter. Let me take care of you the way I should have from the beginning. We can put all this ugliness behind us, start fresh. You'll have everything money can buy, education, travel, a proper place in society." Lena's answer was to clutch the oilcloth bundle tighter against her chest. "I'd rather die than go with you." The die was cast. The gunfight that erupted in the stage station yard lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but in Dasan's memory, it would stretch like hours. The marshal drew first his revolver, clearing leather with practiced speed, but Deputy Boone was younger and desperate. His shot took the older man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own bullet wild into the night sky. Dasan dove left, tackling Lena and rolling behind a water trough as rifles cracked around them. Splinters exploded from the wooden station wall, and torches casting their light were snuffed out one by flying lead. "Stay down," he shouted to Lena, who clutched the oilcloth bundle with white knuckles. Eleonora had taken cover behind a freight wagon, her school satchel pressed against her chest like armor. One of Harlan's riflemen had a bead on her position, working the lever of his Winchester with mechanical precision. Dasan rose just enough to sight his carbine and put a bullet through the man's thigh, sending him sprawling. The second rifleman swung his weapon toward this new threat, but Boone's pistol barked again, and the man stumbled backward into the station wall. Through the chaos of gunsmoke and shouting, Harlan's voice rose like a preacher's at a tent revival. "Kill them all." "The girl too, she's too damaged to be useful now." The words chilled Dasan's blood. This wasn't about custody anymore, or even about covering up murder. Harlan had revealed his true nature, a man who would kill his own daughter rather than face justice. The wounded marshal had found cover behind a hitching post and was reloading his revolver with shaking hands. Blood darkened his shirt, but his eyes burned with the fanatic light of a man who'd sold his soul for silver and knew the price of betrayal. "Boone," he called to the deputy. "You're making a mistake, boy. These people are criminals. The only criminals I see are the ones shooting at children." Boone replied, emptying his cylinder at the marshal's position. The stage driver, startled from his doze by gunfire, whipped his horses into a panicked gallop that carried his coach away into darkness. Their escape route had just disappeared, leaving them trapped in a hostile town with enemies closing in from all sides. Dasan counted his remaining ammunition, 8 rounds left. Not enough for a prolonged fight, especially with more of Harlan's men likely converging on the station. They needed to move, but where could they go in a town where every alley might hide an assassin? The mine. Lena whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "There's another way out through the mine." "Too dangerous," he replied. "They'll expect that. Not the main entrance. My mother showed me the old ventilation shaft it connects to the canyon behind the mill. They don't know about it." A bullet whined past Dasan's ear, close enough that he felt its heat. The surviving riflemen had found a better angle, forcing them deeper behind the water trough. Soon they'd be pinned down completely. "Can you make it that far?" he asked Lena. She nodded, the pain from her shoulder wound showed in every line of her face. "Better than staying here to die." Eleonora had heard their whispered conversation and made her own decision. She broke from cover behind the freight wagon and ran in a zigzag pattern toward the town's main street, drawing fire away from their position. "I'll go," she shouted back at them. "I'll find another way." Her courage bought them the seconds they needed. Dasan scooped up Lena and sprinted toward the alley that led to the mine complex, while Boone provided covering fire that drove their attackers to ground. Behind them, Harlan's voice rose to a roar. "Find them. Search every building, every hole, every shadow. They don't leave this town alive." The mine complex sprawled across the hillside like a mechanical cancer, all headframes and ore chutes, and the thunder of stamp mills that worked around the clock. Steam rose from a dozen sources, and the air reeked of sulfur and hot metal. Lena led them through a maze of equipment and outbuildings, her knowledge of the mine's layout proving invaluable. Workers stared as they passed, but didn't interfere in a place where industrial accidents claimed lives weekly. A man carrying a wounded girl wasn't particularly noteworthy. Off there. Lena pointed to a wooden structure built into the hillside, barely visible among pipes and cables that snaked everywhere. Ventilation house for the old workings. The building was dark and appeared abandoned, its windows boarded over and its doors secured with a rusty chain. But Lena produced a key from somewhere in her dress, another gift from her murdered mother. Inside, a wooden ladder descended into darkness that swallowed their torch beam like a hungry mouth. The air that rose from below carried the damp smell of deep earth and something else, the bitter scent of fear and old death. "Are you sure about this?" Dasan asked. "My mother explored all the old tunnels. Said they were safer than the new workings because they weren't blasted with too much dynamite." Lena's voice carried bitter irony that spoke of hard-won wisdom. They began their descent into the bowels of the earth, leaving the chaos of the surface behind. But Dasan knew their enemies wouldn't give up easily. Harlan had too much to lose, and desperate men were capable of anything. The underground tunnel stretched ahead, like the throat of some ancient beast carved from living rock by men long dead and forgotten. Dasan's torch threw wavering shadows on walls where picks had left their marks in stone that wept moisture constantly. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the smell of deep earth and ghosts of explosions past. Lena stumbled beside him, her breathing shallow and rapid. The bullet graze on her shoulder had started bleeding again, leaving dark stains on bandages Eleonora had applied. But she pressed forward with stubborn determination of someone who had seen too much death to fear it any longer. "Now there," she whispered, pointing ahead to where the tunnel branched. "The right fork leads to the canyon. The left goes deeper into the old workings." Dasan paused at the junction, listening intently. Behind them, echoing strangely through stone passages, came the sound of voices and scrape of boots on rock. Their pursuers had found the entrance and were following their trail into the underground maze. "How many ways out of these tunnels?" he asked. "Just the one we're heading for. The rest are collapsed or flooded." Lena's voice carried a note of grim finality. "My mother always said the old workings were like a trap, easy to get into, hard to get out of." A distant shout echoed through darkness behind them, followed by yellow flicker of torchlight reflecting off wet stone. Harlan's men were closer than Dasan had hoped, moving fast through tunnels with the confidence of people who knew the layout. They took the right fork, following a passage that sloped gradually upward toward what Lena promised was daylight and freedom. But the tunnel here was in worse condition, with timber supports that groaned ominously under the weight of countless tons of rock overhead. Water seeped through cracks in the ceiling, creating puddles that reflected their torchlight like scattered coins. The air grew fresher as they climbed, carrying hints of sage and pine from the world above. Ahead, the tunnel narrowed dramatically, forcing them to crawl through a gap barely wide enough for their shoulders. On the far side, an old wooden bridge spanned a black chasm that seemed to drop into the earth's core. "My mother said this was the worst part," Lena whispered, eyeing the rickety structure with obvious fear. "The bridge is old, but it's the only way across." Dasan tested the first plank with his foot. The wood was rotten in places, and the whole structure swayed alarmingly under even his gentle pressure. But behind them, the voices of their pursuers were getting closer. "One at a time," he decided. "You go first, you're lighter." Lena started across the bridge, moving carefully from plank to plank. Halfway across, one of the boards cracked under her weight, but held. She made it to the far side and turned back, gesturing for him to follow. Dasan had just stepped onto the bridge when a rifle shot cracked behind him. One of Harlan's men had reached the gap and was firing through the narrow opening. "There they are," the man shouted. "On the bridge." More shots followed, bullets ricocheting off stone walls and splintering the ancient timbers of the bridge. Dasan ran, ignoring the way the structure bounced and swayed under his weight. Behind him, He could hear the gunmen squeezing through the gap, still firing. A bullet took out one of the bridge's support ropes, and the whole thing tilted sickeningly to one side. Dasan dove for the far edge, just as the bridge collapsed, completely crashing into the chasm below with a sound like breaking bones. The gunmen's curses echoed from the other side of the gap, but he couldn't follow now. That should slow them down. Dasan gasped, helping Lena to her feet. But their relief was short-lived. The tunnel ahead curved sharply, and as they rounded the bend, Dasan caught a whiff of something that made his blood run cold, the sweet, deadly smell of marsh gas. "Stop," he hissed, grabbing Lena's arm. "Don't go any further." The air ahead shimmered with invisible death. Methane gas seeping from coal seams in the rock had accumulated in this section of tunnel. One spark from their torch, and they'd both be incinerated. "What is it?" Lena asked, though her nose was already wrinkling at the smell. "Gas. Deadly." Dasan extinguished their torch, plunging them into absolute darkness. "We have to go through, but without light." "Can you do it?" Lena nodded, though he couldn't see her in the blackness. "How far?" "No way to tell. We follow the wall, move slow, try not to breathe too deep." They began their nightmarish journey through the gas-filled tunnel, feeling their way along the rough stone walls. The methane made them light-headed, and more than once Dasan felt his knees buckle. Beside him, Lena was making small, gasping sounds, fighting to stay conscious. Behind them, shouts echoed as their pursuers found the collapsed bridge. But they couldn't follow this route, not without knowing about the gas trap. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they emerged into cleaner air. Dasan struck a match with shaking hands, relieved when it didn't ignite an explosion. They were through the worst of it. Not much further now. Lena whispered, though her voice was weak from the methane exposure. The passage they followed began to widen, and Dasan could hear the sound of machinery ahead, rhythmic thunder of stamp mills and hiss of steam engines. They were approaching the mine's main workings, where crews labored around the clock to extract silver from the mountain's bones. A ladder appeared in their torchlight, leading upward toward a square of lesser darkness. Lena climbed first, despite her injured shoulder, moving with quick efficiency of someone who had navigated these passages before. They emerged into a vast underground chamber carved from living rock, its ceiling lost in shadows above their heads. Rails ran across the floor in multiple directions, carrying ore cars loaded with raw, silver-bearing rock. The air thrummed with sound of distant machinery, and steam pipes snaked along walls like metallic vines. The main shaft, Lena explained, pointing toward a wooden structure that housed the mine's elevator system. "If we can reach the surface." Her words were cut off by the metallic click of a rifle being cocked. From shadows beside the elevator housing, Victor Harlan stepped into view, his expensive suit incongruous in the industrial setting. Behind him came two more men, their weapons trained on Dasan and Lena. "End of the line." Harlan said, his voice carrying clearly across the cavern. "You've led me a fine chase, I'll give you that. But every hunt ends the same way." Dasan counted the odds, 3 armed men against his single rifle, with Lena's safety to consider. Not impossible, but close to it. He needed an advantage, something to tip the scales in their favor. Why?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but audible in the cathedral-like space. "Why kill her? Why kill me?" Harlan's expression softened slightly, and for a moment he looked almost paternal. "Your mother was going to destroy everything I'd built here. 15 years of careful work, all the arrangements I'd made, the people I'd cultivated, she would have brought it all down with her conscience and her ledger books." "She was trying to save lives," Lena said. "She was being naive." Harlan's voice hardened again. "This is a business, girl. People die in mines. It's the nature of the work. A few safety corners get cut, a few inspections get overlooked, and yes, sometimes accidents happen. But that's the price of progress." But there was something else in his voice now, a note of genuine pain that hadn't been there before. "Do you think I wanted to kill her? Do you think I enjoyed watching the woman I—" He stopped himself, but the damage was done. "You loved her," Lena said with sudden understanding. "You really did love my mother." "Love." Harlan laughed bitterly. "Love is a luxury men like me can't afford. I had responsibilities, a position to maintain, investors to satisfy. Sylvie knew that when she came to work for me. She knew what our relationship had to be." "You mean she knew she had to stay silent about being your mistress while you built your fortune on other people's graves?" Harlan's face flushed with anger. "I provided for you both. That money I sent every month, do you think that came from guilt? It came from caring, from wanting to give you the best life possible, by keeping us as your dirty secret, by protecting you from a world that would have destroyed you if they knew the truth." Harlan's voice rose to a shout that echoed off the chamber walls. "Do you have any idea what they would have called you? What they would have done to you? I saved you from that shame." "You saved yourself," Lena replied with quiet dignity. "My mother and I were just inconvenient reminders of your hypocrisy." Dasan watched the interplay between father and daughter with growing unease. There was something else here, some deeper current of emotion that went beyond simple greed or fear of exposure. Harlan's pain seemed genuine, which made him more dangerous, not less. "I tried to do right by you." Harlan continued his voice, taking on a pleading quality. "When Sylvie threatened to expose everything, I offered her a fortune to leave quietly. Enough money to set you both up anywhere in the country. She could have had a new life, a new identity. You could have been a proper lady, not some mine superintendent's bastard." But she refused. She said she owed it to the dead men, the families who'd lost fathers and sons to my criminal negligence. Harlan's voice turned bitter again, as if their deaths weren't already priced into the cost of doing business, as if their widows and orphans weren't being compensated according to territorial law. "So you killed her. I protected my interests. And yours, whether you understand it or not." Harlan stepped closer, his rifle still trained on Dasan, but his attention focused on Lena. "You're my blood girl. My daughter. Everything I've built, every dollar I've earned, every connection I've made, it's all for you. I don't want it. You will. When you're older, when you understand how the world really works, you'll thank me for having the strength to make the hard choices." Harlan's voice took on an almost hypnotic quality. "Think about it, Lena. With your mother gone, you have nothing. No family, no money, no prospects. But I can give you everything: education at the finest schools back east, introduction to proper society, a chance to marry well and live like a lady. All I have to do is forget that you murdered my mother. All you have to do is accept that sometimes good people have to die for the greater good. Your mother's death prevented a scandal that would have ruined hundreds of families, destroyed countless jobs, brought down an entire industry. One woman's life against all that, it was a fair trade." Lena stared at her father with something approaching pity. "You really believe that, don't you? You've told yourself that lie so many times you actually think it's true." Harlan's patience finally snapped. "Then you'll have exactly what you deserve: nothing. Because you're too much like her, too stubborn and idealistic to see the world as it really is." He raised his rifle, and Dasan knew the talking was over. But as Harlan's finger tightened on the trigger, the mine around them began to shake with a rumble that seemed to come from the Earth's core. Water burst through the tunnel they'd just exited, a black torrent that spoke of ruptured sumps and flooded workings. The vibrations from their chase through the passages had weakened supports already compromised by years of careless blasting. "The old workings are flooding," one of Harlan's men shouted over the growing roar of rushing water. But the flood was like nothing Dasan had ever seen. This wasn't just water rising, it was a living thing, a monster of crushing pressure and unstoppable force. It exploded from cracks in the walls with the violence of cannon fire, carrying with it chunks of timber and stone that could crush a man's skull like an egg. The chamber filled with a sound like the end of the world, the scream of tortured metal. The crash of falling beams, the roar of water that had been building pressure for decades, and was now free to reclaim the spaces men had carved from its domain. But Harlan didn't lower his weapon. Even as the water began to rise around his boots, even as his men screamed warnings about the approaching flood, his attention remained fixed on his daughter with the intensity of madness. "Doesn't matter," he said, his voice eerily calm in the chaos. "We finish this here and now." The rifle cracked, but the shot went wide as another tremor shook the chamber. Timber supports groaned overhead, and dust rained down from the ceiling like snow. Dasan dove forward, tackling Harlan around the waist and driving him back against the elevator housing. The rifle spun away into darkness as both men went down in a tangle of limbs, splashing into the rising water that now covered the chamber floor. The water was shockingly cold, fed by underground streams that had been dammed by collapsed tunnels and were now finding new routes to the surface. Dasan grappled with Harlan in the knee-deep flood, both men struggling for advantage as the chamber continued to fill around them. But this was no ordinary flood. The water came in waves, each one higher than the last, crashing against the chamber walls with enough force to shake the mountain itself. Whirlpools formed around the support pillars, creating deadly traps that could suck a man down and hold him until his lungs filled with black water. Harlan was older, but desperate, fighting with the fury of a man who had everything to lose. His hands found Dasan's throat, squeezing with surprising strength while his knee drove upward toward vulnerable ribs. Dasan broke the chokehold with an elbow to Harlan's temple, then spun the man around and wrapped his arm around his neck. But Harlan twisted free and lunged toward where his rifle had fallen, his hands scrabbling in the dark water. One of Harlan's men swung his weapon toward Lena, but she was already moving, scrambling toward the fallen Winchester with desperate speed. The man's shot chipped stone where she'd been standing, and then Dasan's pistol barked from where he grappled with Harlan. The chamber was filling with water now, black liquid rising around the ore car rails and lapping at the bases of support pillars. Steam hissed where it met hot metal, and the air grew thick with moisture and the smell of flooded earth. The shaft. Lena screamed over the roar of rushing water. "We have to reach the shaft." But even as she spoke, the elevator mechanism above them began to groan and screech. The cables were stretching under loads they were never designed to bear, and water was pouring down the main shaft, now turning it into a waterfall that thundered onto the chamber floor. Harlan broke free from Dasan's grip and lurched toward Lena, his face twisted with rage and desperation. But the rising water was making movement difficult, and deadly currents swirled around the chamber like liquid serpents. "If I can't have you as a daughter," he snarled, pulling a pistol from his coat, "then nobody will." But instead of firing at Lena, Harlan turned his weapon toward the elevator controls. If he couldn't escape, he would make sure no one else could either. The gun roared in the confined space, and sparks flew as bullets shredded the mechanism that controlled their only way to the surface. Gears shattered, cables snapped, and the elevator cage came crashing down into the flooded chamber with a sound like the world ending. "You maniac!" Dasan shouted, fighting his way through the chest-deep water toward Harlan. "You've killed us all. Better than letting her testify against me," Harlan replied with mad calm. "Better than watching everything I built crumble because of one girl's conscience." But Lena had other ideas. While the men fought in the rising flood, she had been working her way toward the backup controls, a manual system her mother had shown her years ago designed to operate the elevator if the main mechanism failed. "Behind you," she screamed suddenly. Dasan spun to see the last of Harlan's men rising from behind, an overturned ore car rifle aimed at his back. But before the man could fire, water pressure finally overcame the chamber's defenses completely. The main support beam gave way. With a crack like thunder, and tons of rock and timber came crashing down. The gunman disappeared under the avalanche, his scream cut short by crushing weight. In the chaos that followed, with water rising and debris falling like rain, Harlan made his final desperate play. He lunged through the flood toward Lena, his pistol raised for a point-blank shot that couldn't miss. But Lena was her mother's daughter, and her mother had been nobody's victim. She met his charge with a piece of broken timber, its jagged end catching him in the chest and driving him backward into the swirling water. Harlan went down hard blood, mixing with the black flood. When he tried to rise, Dasan was there, hauling him up by his shirt front. "It's over," Dasan said quietly, though he had to shout to be heard over the roar of the flood. Harlan looked up at him through eyes filled with water and blood, and something that might have been relief. "Is it, you think you've won something here?" "We've won the truth," Lena said, producing the oilcloth bundle from her dress. Despite everything, she'd kept it safe through their underground flight. "And that's enough." But even as she spoke, the chamber continued to flood around them. They'd survived the gunfight, but the mine itself was trying to kill them now, drowning them in water that poured through ruptured passages like tears of the mountain itself. The elevator shaft offered their only escape, but its mechanisms were failing under the assault of falling debris and rising water. They had minutes at most before the entire system collapsed completely. "Can you work it?" Dasan asked Lena, gesturing toward the backup controls. She nodded, though her face was pale with exhaustion and pain. "My mother taught me. Said a woman should know how to run any machine a man could build." As water rose around their waists, Lena fought to bring the backup elevator cage down from the surface. The machinery groaned and sparked, but slowly, agonizingly, the platform began to descend through the waterfall that poured down the shaft. Harlan made one final attempt to stop them rising from the flood with desperate strength. But the water was chest-deep now, and his movements were slow and clumsy. Dasan caught him easily, holding him back, while Lena worked the controls. "Live or die," Dasan told him. "Your choice." For a moment, the two men faced each other in the rising flood. The Apache scout who'd lost everything to mining company greed, and the mine superintendent who'd built his fortune on other people's graves. Then the elevator cage splashed down into the water beside them, and the choice was made. Dasan hauled Lena onto the platform and worked the controls with shaking hands. As they began to rise through the cascade of water pouring down the shaft, he looked back once at Victor Harlan. The man was still standing in the flooded chamber water now, up to his shoulders, his expensive suit ruined beyond repair. He made no attempt to reach the elevator or call out for rescue. Instead, he watched them rise toward the surface with eyes that held something that might have been relief. "Forgive me," he called up the shaft, his voice barely audible over the roar of falling water. Whether he was speaking to Lena or to some higher authority, Dasan couldn't tell. But as the elevator cage broke through into daylight, carrying them out of the flooded depths toward the surface world, he thought he heard the sound of a man weeping. Or perhaps it was just the mountain itself mourning for all the secrets buried in its depths. Dawn broke gray and cold over Sable Junction, painting the mining town in shades of ash and iron. The Black Lark mine stood silent for the first time in years, its stamp mills stilled and its headframe draped in morning mist. Word of the flooding had spread quickly through the workers' camps, carrying with it whispers of corruption and murder that would remake the territory's politics. Deputy Boone approached from the direction of the mine, his face grim with the kind of knowledge that changed a man forever. He'd spent the night helping to pump water from the flooded workings, though everyone knew it was too late to save anyone who'd been trapped below. "They found him," Boone said quietly, settling onto the courthouse steps beside them. "Harlan. Took 8 men with ropes and pulleys to get his body out of that chamber." Dasan nodded, but didn't speak. There was nothing to say about a man who'd chosen to drown rather than face the consequences of his actions. "What about the others?" he asked finally. "Marshall's in custody, singing like a canary to save his own neck. Half the town councils fled, and the territorial governors sending investigators to sort through the mess." Boone looked at Lena's sleeping form with something approaching reverence. "That girl brought down a whole system of corruption with those papers. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the territorial road, where a small cavalry patrol was riding toward town. At their head rode a man in civilian clothes, whose bearing and authority marked him as someone important. Judge Morrison, arriving a day early for the circuit court session that would never be forgotten in territorial history. The courthouse that afternoon was packed beyond capacity, with miners and townspeople crowded into every available space. Word had spread throughout the territory about the girl who'd exposed the mine's corruption, and men had ridden for days to witness the proceedings. Judge Morrison was a stern man in his 60s, who'd seen every kind of frontier justice in his 30 years on the bench. He read through the ledger pages with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance, occasionally asking Lena to clarify entries or explain the context of particular payments. These documents appear genuine, he declared finally, his voice carrying to every corner of the crowded room. They present clear evidence of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit murder. More importantly, they reveal a pattern of safety violations that directly contributed to the deaths of innocent workers. The crowd stirred at his words, anger rippling through the packed courtroom like heat shimmer off summer stone. Many of these men had lost friends or family members in mining accidents that now appeared to have been preventable. The mine will be closed, pending a full investigation. Morrison continued. All assets will be frozen, and claims for compensation will be heard by a special territorial commission. As for the criminal charges, his gaze fell on the empty chair where Victor Harlan should have been sitting. Death had cheated justice of its most important defendant, but the judge wasn't finished. Let the record show that Victor Harlan died while fleeing lawful arrest for the murder of Sylvie Corbett and conspiracy to defraud the territorial government. His estate will be seized to compensate the victims of his crimes, including his daughter Lena Corbett, whom he wrongfully pursued and attempted to murder. Lena sat straight in her chair, her injured shoulder bandaged, but her spine unbowed. When the judge asked if she wished to make a statement, she rose with the dignity of someone far older than her years. My mother died because she believed in doing right, she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its whispered tone. She taught me that truth is worth more than money, and justice is worth more than safety. I hope her death means something now. The courtroom was utterly silent. As she sat back down, the weight of her words settling over the assembled crowd like snow on winter ground. 3 months after the flooding of the Black Lark Mine, Sable Junction had become a different town entirely. The constant thunder of stamp mills no longer echoed through the valley, replaced by quieter sounds of investigation and reconstruction. Federal marshals worked alongside territorial auditors to untangle 15 years of systematic corruption, while displaced miners waited to learn their fate. Dawson found Lena in the schoolhouse, where she'd been helping Eleonora reorganize the building that would serve as temporary headquarters for the Territorial Commission. The girl moved with purpose, now her injured shoulder healing well, and her voice growing stronger each day. The haunted look that had marked her features during their flight through the wilderness was gradually being replaced by something that resembled hope. Any word from the commission? He asked, settling into one of the small desks that had been designed for children half his size. They're liquidating everything. Lena replied, her hands busy sorting through boxes of documents recovered from the mine offices. The stamp mill, the equipment, even Harlan's house in town. Judge Morrison says the proceeds will go to victim compensation. She paused in her work and looked directly at him, a gesture that still surprised him with its directness. Most people avoided eye contact with Apache scouts, even reformed ones with territorial amnesty papers. There's something else, she said. Something they found in Harlan's private safe that the lawyers want to discuss with me. The safe in question had been discovered in the mine superintendent's office, hidden behind a false wall that had survived the flooding. Its contents had already yielded additional evidence of corruption. More ledgers, correspondence with territorial officials, and proof of bribery schemes that reached far beyond Sable Junction. But according to the lawyers, there was something more personal among the papers, something that concerned Lena directly. They walked together to the Silver Horn Saloon, which had been converted into a temporary courthouse. While the regular building underwent repairs, Judge Morrison waited for them at a table that had once hosted poker games and was now covered with legal documents and evidence boxes. "Miss Corbett," the judge said, rising as they approached. "Thank you for coming. There's a matter we need to discuss regarding your father's estate." The word father still made Lena flinch, though she'd grown better at hiding her emotional reactions. She took a seat across from Morrison, while Dasan positioned himself nearby, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to respect her independence. "What kind of matter?" she asked. Morrison reached into a leather portfolio and withdrew a sealed envelope yellowed with age and marked with her name in Harlan's distinctive handwriting. This was in his personal safe, along with instructions that it be given to you in the event of his death. According to the date on the seal, it was written 3 years ago and updated regularly. Lena stared at the envelope as if it might contain a snake. "I don't want anything from him." "I understand your feelings," Morrison said gently. "But legally, you have the right to know what it contains. And practically speaking, it might affect the disposition of his estate." With reluctance that showed in every line of her posture, Lena broke the seal and unfolded the papers inside. As she read, her expression changed from suspicion to surprise, to something that might have been confusion. "It's a trust fund," she said finally. "Set up in my name 3 years ago, funded by regular payments from the mine's profits. There's enough money here to—" She paused, calculating figures that seemed impossible. "To live comfortably for the rest of my life." Morrison nodded. "Your father may have been many things, Miss Corbett, but he did provide for your future. The question is what you want to do with his bequest." Dasan leaned forward to read over Lena's shoulder, his eyes scanning the legal language that laid out Harlan's provisions for his daughter's care. It was comprehensive and detailed, covering everything from living expenses to educational opportunities to medical care for her hearing loss. But there was something else in the papers, a handwritten note in Harlan's careful script that revealed more about the man than all his public statements combined. "I know you'll hate me for what I've done." Lena read aloud, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And you have every right to. I killed your mother to protect the life I thought I was building for you. But I understand now that I destroyed the only thing that might have made that life worth living. Use this money to become the woman she wanted you to be, not the one I tried to make you. It's the only gift I can give you now that isn't stained with blood." The words hung in the air of the converted saloon like smoke from a funeral pyre. Around them, sounds of the ongoing investigation, continued voices discussing evidence papers, rustling the steady scratching of pens, recording testimonies that would reshape the territory's future. "There's more," Morrison said quietly. "A provision that allows you to redirect the trust's funds to any charitable purpose you choose. Your father apparently anticipated that you might not want to benefit personally from money earned through his criminal activities." Lena set the papers down on the table and stared out the window toward the silent mine complex. Dasan could see her thinking, weighing the moral complexity of accepting help from the man who'd murdered her mother. "The school," she said finally. "Eleonora's been talking about starting a proper boarding school for miners' children with medical facilities for those injured in industrial accidents. Children like me who can't hear properly or who've been hurt by the greed of mine owners." Morrison smiled for the first time since the proceedings had begun. "That would be a fitting use of the funds. And it would ensure that your father's legacy becomes something positive rather than merely destructive. There's one condition." Lena continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "The school has to be open to everyone. White children, Indian children, Mexican children, anyone who needs education and medical care. No one gets turned away because of who their parents were or what color their skin is." The judge nodded his approval. I think that can be arranged. As they prepared to leave the saloon, Dasan felt a hand on his arm. Lena was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Something that might have been gratitude, mixed with affection, but also with the kind of independence that meant she no longer needed a protector. What will you do now? She asked. The territorial government offered you that scouting position again. Dasan had indeed received an offer to return to his old role, helping to map remote regions of Arizona territory and mediate disputes between settlers and tribal nations. It was honest work that paid well and used skills he'd developed over decades of frontier life. Thinking about it, he said. But first I want to make sure your school gets built properly. Someone needs to keep an eye on the contractors, make sure they don't cut corners the way Harlan did. Lena smiled, then the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since that terrible night by the creek, when her world had changed forever. I'd like that, she said. But don't stay because you think I can't manage on my own. I've learned a lot about taking care of myself. I know you have, Dasan replied. Maybe that's why I want to stay. That evening, as they walked back toward Eleonora's house where Lena had been staying, Dasan found himself thinking about Maria again. His daughter would have been proud of what they'd accomplished, he thought. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and a young girl had found the strength to transform tragedy into hope. Tell me about her again, Lena said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. Your daughter, Maria. What would she think of all this? Dasan was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the western mountains. The question didn't hurt as much as it once had, he realized. Maybe because helping Lena had given Maria's death some meaning beyond simple tragedy. She would have been proud, he said finally. Of you especially. She always said the world needed more people willing to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. I wish I could have met her. She would have liked you too. You both have that same fire inside, that refusal to give up when things get hard. They walked in comfortable silence for a while. Two survivors of mining company greed, finding solace in their shared understanding of loss and hope. Do you think it ever really ends? Lena asked as they reached Eleonora's front gate. The corruption, the greed, the willingness to sacrifice lives for profit. Dasan considered the question while watching smoke rise from chimneys throughout the town. People were cooking dinner, reading to their children, living ordinary lives made possible by the extraordinary courage of a 15-year-old girl. Maybe not completely, he said. But every now and then, someone like you or your mother stands up and says, enough. And that makes all the difference. A year later, the Sylvie Corbett Memorial School held its opening ceremony in a building constructed with the finest materials and safest practices available in the territory. Lena cut the ribbon with hands that no longer shook, her voice clear and strong, as she dedicated the institution to the memory of everyone who died for the sake of mining company profits. In the audience, Dasan sat beside Eleonora Pike and watched a frightened girl complete her transformation into a young woman who would spend her life ensuring that other children never faced the tragedies she'd endured. Deputy Boone, now wearing a marshal's badge after his predecessor's imprisonment, stood at attention with the other territorial officials who'd come to witness the ceremony. The school was everything Lena had envisioned, a place where children of all backgrounds could receive education and medical care, regardless of their ability to pay. Special facilities had been built for those with hearing impairments like Lena's, and the staff included teachers trained in the latest methods for helping students overcome industrial injuries. As the ceremony concluded and guests began to mingle in the courtyard, Dasan noticed a familiar figure approaching through the crowd. Matias Arrieta, the Basque sheepherder, who'd helped them during their darkest hour, walked up with a smile on his weathered face. So, Matias said, embracing Dasan warmly, the girl who hid by the creek has become a woman who builds schools. My sheep, they knew she was special from the beginning. Your sheep have good judgment, Dasan replied with a smile of his own. And you stay to make sure her school grows strong. Dasan looked across the courtyard to where Lena was talking animatedly with a group of prospective students, her face bright with the joy of purpose fulfilled. For a while longer, he said. Someone needs to keep an eye on things, make sure the foundation stays solid. That is good. Matthias nodded approvingly. Some foundations are worth protecting. The sun set behind the mountains as the ceremony concluded, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded everyone present why this harsh land was worth fighting for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight there was hope. As the last guests departed and the school grounds grew quiet, Dasan found himself standing with Lena beside the memorial plaque that honored her mother's memory. The bronze inscription caught the last rays of sunlight, making the words seem to glow with inner fire. She would be proud, he said quietly. I hope so, Lena replied. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough, if the school will really make a difference. Now look around you. Dasan gestured toward the building where lights were already burning in the dormitory windows as the first students settled in for the night. Children who might have grown up illiterate are learning to read. Young people damaged by industrial accidents are getting medical care. Most importantly, they're all being taught that their lives have value, regardless of what society might tell them. That's what my mother believed, Lena said, that everyone deserves a chance. And now you're making sure they get it. They stood in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the valley. The mine's headframe was barely visible against the stars, a ghostly reminder of the corruption they'd fought and defeated. But the school beside them was warm with light and life a beacon of hope for the future. The territorial government wants me to testify at more trials, Lena said eventually. Other mining companies, other corruption cases. They say what we did here could help clean up the whole territory. Will you do it? Yes, she said without hesitation. The truth deserves to be heard no matter how powerful the people trying to hide it. Dasan smiled at the determination in her voice. The frightened girl he'd found by the creek was gone, replaced by a young woman who understood that justice required constant vigilance. Your mother raised you well, he said. So did you. Lena replied, surprising him with the simple honesty of the statement. You taught me that standing up for what's right is worth any risk. As they walked back toward town, Dasan reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. He'd set out to track elk and ended up helping to bring down a criminal empire. He'd failed to save his own daughter from mining company greed, but he'd helped another girl transform that same greed into a force for good. Perhaps that was how justice really worked, not through grand gestures or perfect victories, but through ordinary people doing extraordinary things when the moment demanded it. The stars wheeled overhead as they reached the town's edge, the same stars that had watched over their desperate flight through the wilderness and their final confrontation in the flooded mine. But now, those stars looked down on a changed world, one where truth had triumphed over lies and hope had conquered despair. In the distance, a train whistle echoed through the valley, carrying with it the promise of new arrivals, perhaps students for the school, or investigators seeking justice, or simply families looking for a fresh start in a land where such things were now possible. The sound faded into the night, leaving behind only the gentle sounds of a peaceful town settling into sleep. And in that peace, hard won through struggle and sacrifice, both Dasan and Lena found something they'd thought they'd lost forever. They found home.